Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this Workers' Party online meeting, Anguish in America, as we discuss the recent events in America, the killing of George Floyd that have led to riots and protests, and the potential use of the military to repress these protests. We'll be hearing from George Galloway, and then we'll be in discussion with members of the Workers' Party of Britain. Over to you, George.
Thank you very much, Dan. Comrades and friends, thank you for watching. Whether you're watching right now on this baking hot summer's evening, or you'll watch when the sun goes down, or over the next few days, the audiences for these Tuesday night meetings is extraordinarily impressive and interesting to us in the Workers' Party, and we hope to recruit you. We want to educate you, we want to agitate you, we want to organize you, but we also want to recruit you, because it's our position that only organized working class party like ours can take our people forward. This is a momentous week. In fact, 2020 is turning into a most momentous year, and it's only not even halfway through, or it is just exactly halfway through, and who knows what the rest of the year will have in store for us. I'm going to be talking about the anguish in America, but I want to set the scene in a couple of important regards first. I want to make this clear. You don't have to be black to be ruthlessly oppressed by the capitalist state forces. These forces exist to repress any existential threat to the power of our rulers. And I have lived through quite some chapters which illustrate that. But one of them I want to highlight is the situation of the yellow vests in France, which for more than 1 year were battling the huge might of the French forces of the ruling elite in France. And nobody in the liberal classes, in the Chatterati, in the Guardian or the Observer or the Independent or the BBC, nobody gave a toss for the overwhelmingly white working class people who were being brutally assailed every time they stepped onto the streets of France, which was for a long time, every day, and certainly every Saturday, the tear gas flew thickly. The rubber bullets, which are being highlighted now in the United States of America, were blinding scores of people on the streets of France. The broken bones, the eyelessness, the head injuries, and even the deaths of the yellow vest protesters in France showed that any challenge to the power of the ruling class in France would be met by overwhelming force, which is the purpose of these forces. They're not called forces for nothing. And I don't make that point to illustrate the hypocrisy of the Guardianistas who are in anguish over America, but were completely unmoved about the working class people of France. That's not the reason I'm making that point, though of course it illustrates that. I'm making the point that you don't need to be black to be oppressed, repressed, and brutally quashed by the ruling elite and its system. And of course, it didn't just happen in France. I've lived a long life by the grace of God, and I lived for a whole year on the front line of the miners' strike of 1984-1985. Indeed, I'm an honorary member of the National Union of Mine Workers, South Wales Area, Mardy Lodge. I was at the front of brutal repression by the British state forces of an overwhelmingly white working class uprising in defense of their families, their communities, their work, their livelihood. That's all the miners were demanding, the right to go underground and toil at the coal face. And because they were prepared to defend their livelihood, their workplace, and the community in which it was situated, they were ruthlessly treated, and nowhere more so than at Orgreave, where over several days the British state forces, uniformed and ununiformed, including military and special force and intelligence service infiltration, the British miners were bludgeoned, brutally bludgeoned, and none of them were black. Indeed, the pictures I saw last night coming out of Philadelphia were a huge gang of white thugs were roaming the streets with billy clubs and baseball bats. Took me back to the early days of Jimmy Hoffa's leadership of the Teamsters Union, when the Teamsters were making their members the best paid workers on the planet. They were regularly attacked by these billy clubs, these baseball bats, by hired goons of the company. Indeed, all of the early struggles of the American working class and the American trade unions, the IWW, and other unions, including politically right-wing unions, but industrially militant unions, were overwhelmingly white working class people being brutally attacked by the forces of the state and their auxiliaries, a point to which I shall return. But the United States, of course, is a special country in many ways. And one of its specificities is its extraordinary ethnic complexity. The presence in the United States of scores of millions of African Americans, black people, whose ancestors mainly were dragged to the country in chains as slaves, usually on British ships, building up the wealth of the British bourgeoisie in Bristol, in Glasgow, in Liverpool, and in London, out of the trade. The black people that were dragged to the United States and were enslaved as owned property. The slave owners would make an inventory of their assets, which would include the number of cows that they had, the number of sheep, and the number of slaves, usually in that order. And of course, these slaves now have children who had children who had children. And although the slave trade was finally defeated with Lincoln's victory in the American Civil War, just before he turned the US cavalry westwards to go and complete the absolute genocide of the indigenous Native Americans. So don't imagine that the defeat of the slave trade was the end of the story. The United States was built in what is in otherwise a kind of Garden of Eden. Anyone who's traveled across the United States would have to concede that this is the most breathtakingly beautiful subcontinent of them all, from sea to shining sea. It is breathtaking. But this Garden of Eden, because of how it was obtained and how it was built, has been cursed from the beginning with the scars that we are seeing lividly exposed this week on the television. I know not all of you are religious believers, but a country built on the original sins of slavery and genocide is not likely, despite however many times they invoke the name of God, to be much blessed by the Almighty. And they have not been. Their land has, but their society has not been. And of course, there are now huge communities of color in the United States, above, way beyond the number of African Americans in the country. It will not be that long before Latino people in the United States constitute, together with the African Americans, a majority in the state. And the racism which has scarred the United States for centuries shows no sign of being defeated, as everyone watching, particularly on social media today, can see. The freeing of the slaves by Lincoln and the victory of the Union forces in the United States Civil War, which was a truly gigantic war, of course, with millions of casualties, in many respects a precursor to the First World War on the Western Front, a gigantic war which further scarred America, was not the end of the story. Although the slaves were freed, they lived lives of subjugation, of oppression, marginalization, super exploitation, and systematic discrimination, including in all aspects of civil rights. The facts are that Jim Crow, the segregationism in the United States, did not end even in the United 60s, in 1960s, when it was officially ended. But just get your head around that. In the 1960s, the swinging 60s, it was still not possible for well-known recording artists to perform to unsegregated audiences. When Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin and their great friend Sammy Davis Jr. were performing in ritzy hotels in Las Vegas, Sammy was not allowed to sleep in the same hotel as Frank and Dean were. Imagine that. And the discrimination, of course, did not end even when overt segregation ended. Black people could legally piss in the same pot as white people by the end of the 1960s, but it would be viewed askance if they did. And what Malcolm X called the internal colonies of the United States, the ghettos, overwhelmingly populated by people of color, then black people, now black and Latino and some of the Asian communities in the United States, continued as colonies. Super exploited, all workers are exploited, all workers in the United States are exploited, but the workers of color overwhelmingly occupy the lowest order of employment, paid the least with the least secure terms of employment, and discriminated against at every level, not the least of which is at the level of internal security in the state. And this is not a new thing either. Believe it or not, on this day, 89 years ago, that is to say, in the lifetime of at least one man watching this tonight that I know of, 89 years ago today, the Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma, was overwhelmed by white racist gangs with the overt support of the police, who stood by and allowed it to happen. Tulsa, Oklahoma, 89 years ago, was a kind of New York City. It was booming. That's why the area was called the Black Wall Street. It was filled with successful black businesses. A black middle class was emerging, and that was the problem. That could not be countenanced. And 200 black people were murdered that day, 89 years ago. And the Businesses were, of course, burned to the ground, the scorched earth being all that remained. And of course, but for Bob Dylan, we would never have heard of Emmett Till on this side of the Atlantic. Emmett Till, a young boy in 1955, the year after I was born, who was lynched in a barn and thrown into a southern sea, his life's blood staining it red. And his crime was looking at a white girl. But for Bob Dylan, we'd never have heard of poor Hattie Carroll, slain by William Zanzinger with his diamond-tipped cane that he hurled down the table and killed her. But for Bob Dylan, we'd never have heard of Reuben Hurricane Carter, falsely incarcerated, fitted up in New Jersey, in Paterson. But of course, we don't need to wait for a troubadour to write songs now. As Will Smith put it, I thought very brilliantly just the other day, racism's not rising, it's being filmed. And that is the key difference from the era of Emmett Till, from the era of poor Hattie Carroll, from the era even of Reuben Hurricane Carter. Now every move that is made is being filmed. And my goodness, what a week it has been. I've just been, as I am every night, interviewed on American television, on RT America. And I made this point, that the videos of the hideous violence being dished out by the American police, National Guard, state troopers, is now being filmed and shown and racking up 30, 40, 50 million views. And I've just seen one in Texas, which will startle you even in the teeth of what you've seen this week, a 16-year-old boy shot dead in the head by a sniper whilst standing peacefully protesting a good distance from the security forces. These videos, the fact that racism is now being filmed is changing the terms of engagement and has moved masses in the United States. Masses of all colors, by the way, and that's a significant new development. In the 1960s, the struggle against Jim Crow segregation was really the province of Black people and white Jews, communists and leftists. The mass of the people who were doing the protesting in Montgomery, Alabama, and against the Jim Crow laws then in place, did not contain many white people who were not Jewish, who were not communists. And at that time, those two things were almost a synonym in the United States of America. That has changed, sadly, for the worse, but for the better. The young people of America of all colors have mobilized in their millions this week since the lynching of George Floyd. Of course, some of these events have turned extremely ugly. I'm and the Workers' Party are against riots. Riots go up like a rocket, but they come down like a burnt stick. They do not advance the cause of working class unity and transformative politics. Indeed, they empower reaction, and I'll come to that also in just a minute. But it must be said, and this is not a conspiracy theory, there's plenty on the internet where you can actually see it happening. There's undoubtedly far right and police provocateurs at work on these demonstrations to strengthen the hand of the right, to strengthen the hand of reaction, piles of bricks being handily left for no apparent reason for people to throw through the windows of department stores and the rest. The rioters who are attacking small businesses and beating their owners who try to defend them, the rioters whose purpose is to get a new pair of Nike trainers. That's not where it's at, and sets the movement back. But the vast majority of the people out on the streets in the United States are not there to grab a pair of Nike trainers through a broken window. They are there to confront the racism, injustice, inequality of life for the mass of the people in the internal colonies that Malcolm spoke about, but also right across America. In parenthesis, it needs to be said this: half of all Americans, 50% of all Americans are either officially living in poverty or a category called near poverty, which, when you analyze what they mean by near poverty, is poverty itself. Half of all Americans could not survive a $400 emergency. That's a £300 emergency, neither on cash or on credit. They could not muster $400 in credit. Half of all Americans. 100 million Americans now have no health insurance. The 70 million that never had it, added to by the mass unemployment which now exists amongst all ethnic, racial groups in the United States. We're talking about a country where half of the people are living in poverty, and where not 1%, but 0.1% of people live in lives of gilded luxury, almost impossible to believe. In the Hamptons, in Beverly Hills, in parts of Manhattan, and other extremely wealthy places in the United States. 0.1% of the American population lives lives of unimaginable luxury, whilst half of the people live lives of absolute poverty. Now, this moment that we have arrived at, and the reason for this meeting being on this subject this evening, is that all the conditions which would be required for the introduction of fascism in the United States are now present in the current situation. That's not to say that the United States is now a fascist country. It is not. But all of the conditions for fascism are now present. And the American working class, Americans who think like us, people on the left, socialists, communists, revolutionary people, must wake up to the fact that the terms of everything changed with the conduct of President Trump last evening in Washington, D.C., when, to the clear sound of gunfire and the thunder of mounted police hooves, the president announced the militarization of his own country. And this has caused a great shock around the United States, indeed around the world, which is a little bit surprising because the United States has been militarizing other people's countries for almost every year that it has existed. As I said on Moats the other night, 97% of the years of the existence of the United States of America, it has been at war somewhere in the world. And now they're at war with their own people. Trump's statement was blatantly illegal, blatantly unconstitutional. Not in Washington. He has the power to deploy the military in Washington because they refused to make Washington, D.C. a state precisely because it has a black majority, a sizable black majority. So Trump can do what he likes in Washington, D.C., but he cannot send the United States Armed Forces into Illinois or into Michigan. He has no power to do that. But last night, he openly stated that he would do that. And the deafening silence from the Democrats who control these states, like Illinois, like Michigan, like New York State, like so many others, deafening silence from the Democratic Party seems to me to indicate that they will find no real opposition from the Democrats. And so the possibility now exists, whether Trump follows through on it, we'll have to wait and see, that the armed forces of the United States, the Marines, that's what we're talking about, will be deployed on the streets of American states that refuse to call up the National Guard, refuse to militarize the already tinderbox situation that they have in their states. The president will do it for them. He will dominate the streets. That's what he said. And he said he would do it with the United States military. Now, of course, legal action would be mounted, but the pace of justice is no faster in the United States than it is here, and the presidential election is fast approaching, and that's one of the reasons why Trump is acting as he is. He has seen a moment to militarize the streets, to create an us and them dichotomy. He sees the Democrats paralyzed like rabbits in the headlights on the highway, unable to decide which way to go, to side with the people or to side with the president and his military adventure. For the first time since the US Civil War 150 years or so ago, he has spotted an opportunity for a dichotomy which will benefit him in the ballots, if those ballots take place in November. And you should not rule out the possibility of those elections being postponed. Now, more controversially, and I'm not speaking for the Workers' Party on this, we have no view on it. We have had no possibility to reach a view on it. But I know many of you, many liberals around the country also, hate the existence of the gun laws of the United States. The Second Amendment of the United States Constitution clearly gives the people the right to bear arms and form well-organized militia to resist tyranny, resist foreign tyranny, resist domestic tyranny, resist the tyranny of a president of the United States who began to regard himself as an emperor, as a king. Now, I've never been as hostile to the right to bear arms as most people on the left have been. But whether you were in the past or not, it is clear to me now that if I was living in the United States, the last thing in the world I would do right now is lay down my arms. The last thing in the world I would do would be to allow a monopoly on armed force to reside with Donald Trump or his auxiliaries. And those auxiliaries are real. You can find them easily enough with a few touches of the keyboard. You can find them itching to receive the green light from the president to take their automatic weapons down onto the street and to destroy those who are protesting and those who are merely watching, to destroy anyone who's not like them, who doesn't look like them, doesn't love like them, doesn't live like them. A massacre could very easily happen in the United States in this febrile atmosphere. You saw a taste of it in Michigan State, in the Capitol building, when heavily armed with automatic weapons, heavily armed men protesting about their need for a haircut against the lockdown, actually stormed the building without a single tear gas canister being fired, without a single rubber bullet being deployed against them, where the police did absolutely nothing as mobs of armed white men stormed the government building in the state of Michigan, causing the governor to flee from the building and hide in a safe room in the building. These people haven't gone away, you know, and there are millions of these people in the United States, and they are all heavily armed. So if it was me, I'd be making sure that me and my family were also armed. The Second Amendment doesn't just give the right to bear arms. It gives the right to all American citizens to bear arms. Now, I never imagined I'd be talking like this, but the situation that has developed overnight makes it impossible to address the current situation without honestly evaluating all of the possibilities. It is a very dangerous moment in the United States of America. The idea that the United States is the leader of the free world is an idea that now lies a smoking ruin. In the last 12 months, the British press used that phrase 1,515 times. That America was the leader of the free world. Who would say it today? Nobody. No one in their right mind would so describe the United States today. The United States soft power has been utterly devastated by the events of the last week. The idea that anyone anywhere else in the world wants to be like the United States of America is utterly risible. That anyone anywhere in the world is looking to make their country more like the United States, again, absolutely risible, laughable, if it was not so tragic. And so finally, the idea dies that the United States, of all people, has the right to police the rest of the world when it cannot police its own streets without gunning down innocent, unarmed, peaceful people, and where black bodies continue to twist like strange fruit, not just from southern trees, but on the streets of Minneapolis too. Thanks very much for listening. I'm happy to take questions or listen to contributions from the members on Zoom. Thank you very much indeed, Dan.
Thank you, George. Well, we certainly have a lot of questions and comments coming in from the membership. It's obviously a topic that's inspired a lot of thought and outrage and emotion. So let's see. Fran, go ahead, Fran.
Evening, George. First, I wanted to say the party has solidarity with everybody protesting in America. But also, my point to you is, do you believe that the USA has overstretched itself, like in the last 20 years since Iraq? They failed in Iraq, they failed in Syria, they failed in Venezuela, they're failing in Hong Kong. And my second point is, do you think that this is like the USA's Tiananmen moment and that we shouldn't forget what is going on? We've got miles of propaganda for years to come out of all this. That's my point for you to answer, George.
Yeah, thanks, Fran. There is no general currently serving in the United States Armed Forces who's ever won a war, has ever been on the winning side in a war. Chairman Mao was premature when he described the United States as a paper tiger. It's not even now a paper tiger, but it is a dying tiger. The United States empire has failed utterly to impose its will in one theater after another, decade after decade. And that's not going to change anytime soon. As I used to say at the time of the Iraq War, in one street alone, a street I happen to know well, Haifa Street in Baghdad. 220 American soldiers lost their lives in that street. And by the time the Americans scuttled out of Iraq under fire, no American soldier had set foot in Haifa Street for several years. The war on Iraq was launched to terrify the world with American power, but it achieved the precise opposite. It actually showed the world that actually there was nothing to be terrified of. That while the United States had overwhelming power in the sky, it could not put American boots on the ground anywhere and prevail, because the American soldiers were fighting for pay, not for anything more than that. And so the American empire is undoubtedly dying. And that's one of the reasons why it's come home, if you like, it's come home to die. The last battlefront is the internal battlefront. I think in the short term, it will probably benefit Trump in the elections in November. I happen to think he was scheduled to win those anyway. But in the medium term, it will hasten the demise of the American empire.
Thanks, George. We have a question from Helen.
Hi, Helen.
Hi, George. Yeah, I've heard you say before that when America sneezes, the rest of the world gets flu. And it's good to see that, you know, there's been support in different parts of the world for these people that are rising up in America, if that's what you'd call it. Do you think it's time for a global uprising of the oppressed and the, you know, working classes, the downtrodden, both from the West and obviously, I mean, there's a lot of it going on in Middle Eastern countries anyway. But is it time the West started to rise against tyranny as well?
Well, there are very few countries in the world, unfortunately ours is one of the very few, where there is not a substantial challenge going on to the prevailing orthodoxy, to the power. And there are very few continents where that's not happening. Every place and every time is specific to its own conditions, of course, and it's not for us to lay down a schema for other people. But we think that the political approach of seeking to unite the working class people on the basis of class is the best, certainly for us. It might not be applicable everywhere at all times, but for us, the patient building of a clear working class perspective and politics which unite rather than divide the working people of the country is the way forward. I wouldn't call it an uprising. My door would probably get kicked in and I'd be dragged off to jail live on Zoom. If I did, it's not an uprising as such. We are working within the parameters of the law and our democracy here in this country. And there's a lot can be achieved within those parameters. If the ultimate goal could not be achieved, that would be a matter for the ruling class and not for us. We believe in the democratic politics of working class unity.
And somewhat ironic there, you mentioned uprising, but Trump called on Twitter only a few weeks ago for governors of US states to rise up against the federal government.
Yes, Liberate Minnesota was one of them. He tweeted in capital letters, liberate Minnesota, liberate Michigan, liberate Pennsylvania. And what he meant was, these are all dog whistles. What he meant was, get your guns and get out on the street. Show them the power that we have, a power which we'll not be afraid to use.
And our next question comes from Sophia. Go ahead, Sophia. Oh, apologies.
Hello, can you hear me?
There we go.
I can, Sophia, thanks.
Oh, you've been muted again. Try again, Sophia.
Try again.
Okay, right. Hi, George. How you doing?
Good. Nice to see you again, Sophia.
Good. Yeah, the protests are shattering the illusion of democracy in the US, and I thought many people are waking up. We live in such an individualistic, capitalist society where we worship celebrities, and by celebrities I also mean, you know, politicians, members of Congress, Bernie Sanders, AOC, Jeremy Corbyn, for example, and we kind of expect them to save us. But they have a seat at the table and they're telling people to go home. And those people, a lot of people don't have homes and certainly won't have homes after this pandemic. They're telling people to vote, and they've already voted for a Democrat. They've already voted for a black man. And what did that president do? How did he respond to the protests of the Native Americans at the Dakota pipeline? How did he respond to the poisoning of the people in Flint? You can go on with the bombings in Libya. It just doesn't matter who you vote for. And I know the liberals are frothing at the mouth at Trump. Yes, he is a fascist. Yes, he's awful. But it doesn't matter who you vote for under this capitalist system, which is inherently racist, whether it's for-profit prisons, regime change wars. We're not free under it, and we never will be. And we need to make sure that we, the true revolutionaries, are going to come from the working class. And I feel for that we need to learn and we need to unlearn, because I'm sure there's lots of people that will agree and have the same experience. But at school, my education of the civil rights movement in America was Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, who was very, very peaceful, and a little bit of Malcolm X, but and the Black Panthers, basically a terrorist organization. And that was it, closed book. And that goes for the revisionism of the Soviet Union. You can go on. It's a whitewashing of history. And so I think we all need to make a conscious effort to learn. Which has been actually really refreshing since joining the Workers' Party. We've had these meetings, people have reached out, people have shared books and theory. And so the question really is, how do we put these ideas and theories that we're all sharing into direct action? You say writing isn't the right way to go. What is the right way to go about things? People feel that the destruction of capital is the only way to destroy capitalism at this current time. What would you say would be the best approach, George?
Well, first of all, that's a really outstanding contribution and shows the level of the cadre that we are building in the Workers' Party. And I hope many thousands of people see and hear that contribution. As Malcolm said, getting a seat at the table is no guarantee that you'll get fed. You might actually be at the table as a waiter. And that's exactly what some of these celebrities that you mentioned are. They are the dressing at the table, but they're certainly not eating in the way that the people who run the table are eating. And people like AOC talk left and act right. And that's true of the Democrats as a whole, but it's especially true of the celebrity squad of Democrats, every single one of whom has passed Donald Trump's budgets, has allowed to pass his so-called security legislation. Even Bernie Sanders failed to turn up to vote in a vote that could have been won to block the renewal of the Obama era Donald Trump plus security surveillance state in the United States of America. Joe Biden was very clear about the spirit of compromise that he represents. There's no need to shoot them in the heart. Why don't we shoot them in the leg? Unarmed people, why don't we shoot them in the leg rather than the heart? And he thought that he was saying a good thing, although I'm not sure he remembers it, because I'm not sure he remembers anything after he has said or done it. No, voting for one or other of the cheeks of the same arse will not achieve anything in the United States. As long as it's evil versus more evil, and in the case of Biden and Hillary Clinton before him, that's actually debatable. Either way, you're voting for evil. As long as the people of the United States are faced with that choice, then the largest voting bloc in the United States, i.e. those who do not vote, will continue to increase, continue to expand. What we need is a party of labor in America. We need a working class party in America. We need people to get behind a presidential candidate that is neither Tweedledee nor Tweedledum. And we need an end to that kind of politics. Evil versus evil merely ensures that evil triumphs. No, you're not destroying capital if you riot, Sophia. You think the looter can only steal that which he can carry, and Nike can easily absorb the number of trainers carried out of their Manhattan store. It will not make a scintilla of an impact on their bottom line, not a scintilla. So destroying shops and stealing trainers and designer clothes and so on does nothing to advance the struggle of the working class. Indeed, it makes it easier for reaction, for the right to turn the masses against the rioters. That's not the kind of politics that we stand for. We believe in organizing people. We believe in agitating people, and we believe in educating people. And when we get out from this lockdown, and when we can do that out in the streets, that's what we'll be doing.
Fantastic. Thanks, George. And thank you, Sophia, for that wonderful contribution. I'm just going to take this opportunity to speak on organizing. We have thousands of people watching the stream actually at the moment who, if you want to come and get involved with this kind of politics, come and discuss with us. We're now having multiple, aside from this one, multiple organizing meetings per week to come and discuss, educate, learn, as well as regional organizing meetings online, so we can hit the ground running once it's safe to get back out on the streets and start organizing. So go to workerspartybritain.org, sign up and get involved. And we have a couple of questions that have been emailed in from members who can't join us tonight, unfortunately. The first comes from David, who asks, as we are witnessing rage and fury, yet unseen in the USA, to prevent the long existing racism in Britain to plunge us into the same devastation, how should a member of a minority ethnic background react if they were subjected to racism and unfair treatment in society or institutionally? And how should white fellow citizens react if they witness discrimination or racism against minorities?
Well, first of all, this is not unprecedented at all. You're probably lucky that you weren't around in 1968. In 1968, in the riots of 1968, the amount of damage, the length of the struggle was far, far greater than this, at least to date. The riots on the murder of Dr. Martin Luther King, who, by the way, should not be caricatured as some kind of Boy Scout liberal peacenik. He was not. He was murdered in Atlanta because he was in Atlanta to address the striking garbage workers in Atlanta who were engaged in a mighty labor struggle. Dr. King was beginning to synthesize working class political demands, anti-Vietnam War political demands, and the demands of the Black people in America. And that synthesis was of potentially deadly force for the ruling elite in the United States, which is why they murdered him. And ditto Malcolm. Malcolm could be tolerated as a slightly zany so-called Muslim in a weird, actually non-Muslim sect. But when he became part of mainstream Islam, when he abandoned the ideas of separatism, at one stage campaigning for Black people in America to return to Africa or to have certain parts of the United States set aside for them as Black states of the United States, when he discarded those things and began to concentrate on unity with the oppressed white people in the United States and unity with the all religions and all the people oppressed in the United States, he too became a mortal threat, and that's why he was murdered. I'm perfectly sure. Look, racism exists in all societies, but it's part of the armory of capitalism. How else do you maintain a situation where millions, actually tens of millions of white people in America whose arse is hanging out of their trousers, who don't have 2 cents to rub together? How else do you keep them occupied from challenging the system that has left them bereft than by creating and pointing to, across the railway tracks, a group of people even more poor and disadvantaged than them, by fixating poor whites with their marginally better situation than the poor Blacks, you have succeeded in dividing and ruling both communities. We've even got to, look, I hate to digress, Dan, forgive me if this is not a good digression, but it struck me there. Look at the poor working class Protestants in the north of Ireland. What has capitalism, imperialism ever done for them? The only reason why it has maintained the allegiance of a big section of the so-called loyalist community is that they're not Catholics, they're not Irish, they're British. You've got Tom looking down on Dick, even though Tom's situation is, if it is, utterly marginally better than Dick. So racism exists in all societies. It's particularly dangerous in ours because the racists have power and the victims have not. Our society, American society, European society, are all societies dominated by white people. White people have the power, including overwhelmingly the power of force, the guns, the uniforms. So of course you can get a black racist, but the black racist has no power. A white racist is quite likely to be in a position of some power, and in the short term at least, potentially deadly power. So anytime we encounter racism, we oppose it, we work relentlessly against it, But we say to the minorities in Britain, there can be no salvation from what you have experienced under the capitalist system that we have, because what happened to you is part and parcel of living in a capitalist society. And so liberalism, separatism, anarchism isn't going to solve your problem. Only by uniting with other people who are themselves oppressed or have risen against the system of oppression can there be any salvation for you. That's what we believe.
I think there was no need to apologise for that digression. It's a fantastic point, well made. And next question comes from Mara. Go ahead, Mara.
Hi, George. That was a fantastic contribution, and I would like to ask several things, if I'm allowed. First of all, I think that the Black Lives Matter movement is more inspiring than other movements, because it's probably erupts from a visceral fight for survival, in the sense that many other movements aren't, because it's just not the same level of threat. When you fight because you fear being assassinated by the police, you've got more anger than when you fight because of for the more abstract purpose of higher wages or other injustices, which are also important, but not as viscerally important as fighting for your life. So in that regard, I think that the Black Lives Matter movement can be very inspiring. Of course, it has less inspiring and quite strategically disastrous moments when it becomes riotous. But in fact, it has a potential for greatness, I find, because of the anger. But I like you, I doubt that anger can solidify into any direction unless perhaps it unites with more movements. And I was wondering, could we use the Yellow Vest movement and unite these movements together? And I wanted to make an observation that I think many people, especially on the left or people in Britain, I'm not from Britain, I'm Romanian, so I've got a different perspective, but it feels like on the British left, especially Labour, where I come from, there's an illusion that in fact racism nowadays and slavery and things like that are kind of in the past. They still happen a little bit, but they're not what they used to be. Well, in fact, it feels like in the new global system, economic system that we're forced to participate, there's probably more systematic industrial racism than ever. And in my experience, Western, mostly white people, find it perfectly acceptable to buy things and partake in an economy and work for this economy, where in fact,
Can you hear me, Dan?
Oh, yeah, I think Mara's connection has dropped there. Hopefully we can get her back in a minute. I don't know if you can address the first part of her.
Mara, are you back?
hi, I'm
Mara?
back.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure where it cut off, but it feels like the racism is so deeply embedded in the consumerism that we're forced to participate in. It's actually larger than ever. I think there are more brown or colored or people of color in the world slaving away to give Westerners their luxuries than ever before. And that's why a movement like this one can actually be inspiring, because it does hit at the core of the human injustice behind neoliberalism, which is that we feel that some people in Western Europe and the United States deserve all the.
Well, look, Dan, just because the connection is a bit shaky, let me reply to the first part of what Mara said. Kupla Cherry, I'm the only person at the meeting tonight who's written a book in the Romanian language. I hope you read it. Mara, thank you very much for, again, a really high quality contribution. Let me sum it up this way. I was talking the other night to Governor Jesse Ventura, whom I very much hope still will run for president in November. And he was telling us about a black friend of his in Minneapolis, who before he sets out in his car in the evenings, he puts his license, his insurance, his ID on a sticker, suction point on the top of the dashboard of the car. He's black. Chances are he'll be pulled over. When he's pulled over, he'll be asked for his license, his insurance, his ID. And if he bends down to take these things out of the glove compartment, like you or I would routinely, the risk of him being shot by the police officer multiplies exponentially. So in order to avoid being shot dead for being black, he has these things readily available on the top of the dashboard. I don't know if you saw the video the other night, which ended with the incredible crime that was visited on a black American woman called Sandra Bland, who was pulled over by an armed policeman for failing to signal when turning into her own street. And she stood in her own garden on her own property, filming this police officer, pointing a gun at her over an alleged traffic incident. The officer became so enraged that he handcuffed her. He took her to the police station. He locked her up in a cell where she was found dead some hours later. The early part, of course, captured on her own phone and her own video. That's the reality for the lives of black people in the United States. So that kind of super suppression, oppression, supercharged oppression is, of course, only happening to black people in America, but it also happens elsewhere. I play a game with my wife when we are out driving late in the evening, seems like a long time ago now, that if we see a car pulled over, a particular car, we play the game of guessing whether or not the driver is likely to be black. And of course, they almost always are. So that's why you're right. The Black Lives Matter slogan, idea is particularly powerful, visceral, as you put it, because it is literally existential. Black people take a risk every day in the United States of being killed for being black. And if you can't stand by, beside, along with, and be prepared to link arms with people who are oppressed on that scale in a so-called democratic country, a country that is so-called the leader of the free world, there's not much hope for winning you to any other cause. But you're right about the reaction of many white people. I get every time I discuss the issue of slavery, I can count the seconds before I receive the incoming, and it can all be easily categorized. I know what they'll say. The Arabs began slavery. The African chiefs sold their slaves as if that made it better to buy them. If it's true that black chiefs sold them, and that the last recourse, well, I didn't benefit from slavery, so why should I make reparation for it? But of course, even that isn't true, quite apart from that isn't the point. Thanks, Mara. Great contribution.
Shame about the internet connection, but hopefully next week we'll be able to hear from you in full. Couple of questions written in. One from Gerard. how can we distinguish between those seeking justice and those opportunistically pushing their own agenda? And similarly, Rob Sutton has asked, the Democrats are definitely gaining from the situation. How much do you think they're capitalizing opportunistically? And how much, if any, do you think they're involved in stirring up tensions?
Actually, I don't think the Democrats are gaining from the situation. They'll be blamed by the Trump supporters in the United States because they're not Trumpers. But they will not gain the votes of black people whom they are busily betraying. Black people are not going to vote for somebody who wants them shot in the leg rather than the heart. Joe Biden was struck dumb. Nancy Pelosi is still struck dumb. And the Democratic governors across the United States are not just struck dumb, they're on Zoom right now planning how to mobilize the military forces that Trump is instructing them to mobilize. So I'm not sure what's meant by opportunistic agendas. We have an agenda in the Workers' Party. We oppose specific acts of oppression, but our agenda is to generalize from those specific acts of oppression, to teach the people that this did not happen by accident. It's not something that if you stick a plaster on here and there, you're going to resolve. That these problems are systemic, and they flow ineluctably from the capitalist system, the globalized capitalist system, and in particular imperialism. The United States learned how to kill its own people by practicing on foreigners. The armed forces that Trump is going to send into the streets of Chicago or Los Angeles are the same armed forces that have been practicing killing foreigners over the last decades. So this is imperialism and capitalism at work. And we have a responsibility to say so, because to do otherwise would be to deceive the people. It would be to say, well, if we could get better training for police officers, or we could get Jane Doe rather than John Doe in as mayor or police commissioner or governor. That's not where it's at. All of these people will in the end, including AOC, will in the end support the prevailing orthodoxy. They'll all be content with being in the room and maybe even being at the far end of the table, but well below the salt.
Thank you, George. Next, we have a question from Mark. Go ahead, Mark.
Hi, George.
Hi.
Hi there. So I've seen that Donald Trump declaring that he might designate the Antifa a terrorist organization and such. Seen people saying that this could be a precursor to condemning anyone as Antifa and leading to show trials and just anyone that's in the way of the government causing a problem to declare them as such. I was just wondering if you thought this is something that was likely. Myself, I would declare myself an Antifa, and it's not something that I ever expected any kind of Western leader to be saying that they'd be going after.
Yeah, well, both of my grandfathers fought for 6 years against fascism in the Second World War. I guess they would have described themselves as anti-fascists. You see, as far as I know, this Antifa is not an organization anyway. So if something isn't an organization, I'm not sure how you can proscribe it. It doesn't, I'm told, have leaders. So I'm not sure how you can arrest the leaders of something that doesn't exist and who are not leaders. It's a typical Trump eruption and helps polarize the situation. But if you're seriously going to prosecute people for being anti-fascist, well, the United States Armed Forces made a very major contribution, not as major as Hollywood would have you believe, but a major contribution to the defeat of fascism. It's an absurd idea to criminalize anti-fascism. Having said which, and some might not like this point, it is important to conduct anti-fascist activity in a way that does not increase support for the fascists. And we've touched this a little bit over the last few years in relation to Brexit, in relation to Nigel Farage and so on. You see, if you call everybody to the right of you a racist, and if you call every racist a fascist, and if you take the view that the only good fascist is a dead fascist, then the logic of that stream is that you go around killing people because they're to the right of you. And I've seen, I think, some of that in the activities of some of the anti-fascist activists in the United States. And of course, we would, as a Workers' Party, strongly oppose that. Every person to the right of you is not a racist, and every racist is not a fascist, and every fascist is not somebody that we need to go out and kill. That is not the way to address this issue. On the contrary, it inflates support for the very political forces to which you are opposed. And I think that that is a difference between our approach and the approach of some others.
Thank you, George. We have a question on a similar vein from Matt. Matthew, go ahead.
Really, to be honest, in some ways the question's already been answered, but what is George's feelings about UKIP showing solidarity with the terrible murder of George Floyd, in the sense that in the media at least, UKIP is perceived as an ultra-libertarian, right-wing Thatcherite political movement?
Well, I really don't know about that, Mark. You've caught me blindsided. I didn't know if UKIP were still alive, actually. Maybe someone's hacked their Twitter account if they're weighing in on the side of Black Lives Matter. That is a distinct possibility. I'd need further and better particulars on that one.
Thanks, George. And we come to our next question from Yusuf. Go ahead, Yusuf.
Good evening, comrades, learned colleagues, and good evening, George. I've been a Workers' Party member for a couple of months, and I've probably started my re-education within the last year or two. And I probably only share a couple of things in common with you, George. We're both Scots living in London. We both wear glasses, and we both have a thing for hats, although I don't have mine on at the moment. But hopefully, as the years progress, I can share some of your values, and also, more importantly, live up to some of the comments, messages, ideas, and rhetoric that you hold. So that's my vision, is to follow some of the pathways that you're leading us down. It's important that focusing on this matter to show our angst and heartache at what's happening in America just now, although we're not blinded to the fact that there's nothing new here, but it's important to always acknowledge the issues that are at hand. My question is probably around more UK centric, and as you can imagine, that the rhetoric that the liberal class, the mainstream media, the political class is showing in terms of showing their solidarity with the hashtag and the right terminology, it's perhaps typical because there's hardly any action behind that. So I had a question around what would you think what should the UK reaction be here, and what should be the societal or the community related reaction? What should it be here, and what in practical terms should we be doing to help our colleagues and comrades and friends in America, but also at the same time ensuring that this message of standing up for the oppressed is actually heard at the right levels, and real action can happen. So just some ideas or concepts from you on that,
Well,
Gary.
a very beautiful contribution. So many of them this evening. I'm very impressed, and I'm sure the watching audience outside the party will also be. It helps that you're all so wonderfully young. I must say, I feel like your grandfather sitting here. It is an important question. And it brings me back to a point that I have already made, but need to make again. We don't believe in separatism. We don't believe that Muslims should separately organize against anti-Muslim discrimination. We don't believe that Black people should be separately organizing against racial oppression in Britain. We believe in uniting the maximum number of people against the real enemy. And the real enemy is the political class and their ideology, and the rest is just the consequence of the political class and its ideology. In other words, you're not going to, it's not that, we wouldn't oppose, of course, the reorganization of the London police force after the murder of Stephen Lawrence. We support it, but we point out that it will not be sufficient. And if we had pointed it out, if we'd existed then, we'd have been proved amply correct, wouldn't we? When Jean-Charles de Menezes was murdered at Stockwell on the Underground, we would have said that the police investigation of it is not going to go far enough because it was a direct consequence of the atmosphere that existed in Britain at that time because of Britain's imperial role in the assault and destruction of Iraq. And we would have said that Cressida Dick should probably not be promoted as a result of having overseen the execution of an entirely innocent man on the London Underground. And again, we would have been proved to be right on that. So we do not, like some purist, disdain to be involved in this issue or that issue, in this specific demand or that specific demand. We do get involved. We will join with these making these those making these demands, but we will, unlike others, point out the extent to which these demands, this campaign, is insufficient, that it will not actually resolve the problem that is being addressed, because these problems are symptomatic of a deep cancer in our society, and we want to cut that cancer out. And therefore, we are involved in short-term, but also long-term politics. And the long-term politics will be much longer than I'll be around, and it will be people like you and the other people who've spoken tonight from the party who will be taking those demands forward.
Thank you, George. Next, we have a couple of questions written in. First from Richard. I think we can take these ones together. So, Richard has sent in a question for his friend Tagreed. What is to stop the Black population doing a modern version of the Selma to Montgomery March? It would take some of the wind out of the media's sails, claiming they're violent thugs. And Ian asks, given the past week's events and Trump's response, what distinguishes the Trump administration from being fascist?
Well, it will only be fascist when there are no courts prepared to take cases against the abuse of power. It will only be fascist when all the newspapers wholly endorse the activity of Trump, which is the opposite actually of what we have today. It will only be fascist when elections are abolished and no possibility then exists to vote Donald Trump out of office, when there are no elections for the Senate in November. It will only be fascism when hundreds of thousands of people are being rounded up without due process and taken to camps. And it will only be fascist when industrialized mass murder begins to be the order of the day. So it goes without saying, we are rather a long way short of that. I prefer to put it the way I did at the beginning, that all the conditions necessary for fascism in America are beginning to come together and in place. A Mussolini type president, a kind of Duce figure, a huge, armed, and poor for the most part, working class for the most part, not just electoral base, but a potential fighting base for Trump. That's in place. The existence of the sinews of the capitalist state in the armed forces, in the state level forces, and in the police forces, where are heavily present racist ideas and hatred against minorities in the United States. That's all in place. And the power that Trump declared yesterday that he had, which as a matter of fact, legally he does not have, that also would be a precondition for fascism. As to the first point, I've got to tell you that somewhere yesterday, I think Philadelphia, but I may be mixing up the cities, a very significant number of young people, white and black, did set off on a march, and they were then trapped on a highway siding and mercilessly bombarded with gas. So I think in the current atmosphere, if a mass march from Selma to Montgomery were to be announced today, that would not be the right place, because of course the situation is more problematic, not in the South, but in the Midwest and in the North. But if a mass march was planned, there would be every possibility of it being ruthlessly attacked, and perhaps not only by the forces of the state, perhaps by some of these auxiliaries of which I have spoken this evening.
Thank you, George. I think that account included the police firing on the protesters from one side and telling them to move back. And then when they moved back, they flanked them on the other side and started firing from the other direction.
They were literally trapped. They were trapped.
We have a question from Nadia. Go ahead, Nadia.
Good evening, George. I hope all is well with you and Gayatri.
Yes, thank you very much.
I was just wondering, looking at America now and seeing all the protests, all the riots going on, I was just wondering, when is enough enough? I.e., when do you start realizing peaceful protest, it doesn't work anymore? I mean, back when I was 11 years old, I remember you on the TV protesting against the Iraq War. And I remember the huge protest in London. But they still went to war. When do you have to escalate things? The brother of George Floyd, he asked for the rioting to stop and to vote for, the right person. But will they ever allow the right person to be a successful candidate? That's what I was wondering.
Well, in 1968, of course, the Democrats had the clear intention of picking Bobby Kennedy as their candidate to run for president on a platform, a very radical platform by the standards of the time, well to the left of his brother Jack, and he was murdered. And the chances of someone emerging from inside the political class that would stop the drift to disaster was cruelly cut short. And the Democrats fielded a figure who seemed ridiculous at the time, but compared with Joe Biden, wasn't actually ridiculous at all. Hubert Humphrey, who was soundly defeated by Richard Nixon, and everything that came after that, both for the people of Indochina and the people of America, and people all around the world, in fact. So we don't believe that from within the prevailing orthodoxy, any liberation is likely, and we reject the idea that we must choose between one evil and another evil, that we must say that the left cheek of that arse is prettier than the right cheek. They're both part of an arse, and we have a responsibility to say that and to put it that way and to offer a distinct alternative, and we will continue to do that. As to enough is enough, well, enough will be enough when the mass of the people decide that it is enough. We can't decide that for them. We can't, call a general strike because the workers are not yet ready to follow us. We can't say that an uprising needs to happen because that would be futile, because the balance of class forces, the balance of political forces is nothing like, not remotely like being in our favor. We have to concentrate on being right, on being the people who see things most clearly, being the people who explain things most clearly, and projecting the way forward most clearly, and winning more and more working class people to our side. And here in parenthesis, I make this point because it keeps coming up. You don't have to be actually working to be a member of the Workers' Party. You can be unemployed and be in the Workers' Party. You can be retired from working and be in the Workers' Party. You can be someone who's not yet old enough to work. You can be someone who's still in education. So we often get it. Maybe it's disingenuous, but we often get it. But our task is to build mass political support behind the program of the Workers' Party. There are decades when nothing happens, and there are weeks when decades happen. Actually, I think these weeks are weeks in which decades are happening. Not just the situation in America, but the situation over the virus, the pitiful performance of our ruling class in the face of this devastating sickness, which has descended on our people, which has beggared millions of our people, has killed 65,000 of our people, killed by government incompetence, not only by a virus, but by government incompetence, by systemic incompetence. That's why I started out by saying 2020 has already been one hell of a year, and I think it will be a transformative year. And you never know. You see, I always make this point. If you knew what the last straw was, you wouldn't lay it on the back of the camel. You only know that it was the last straw because the camel's back broke. Now, we are not soothsayers. We cannot know when the last straw for the mass of the people will be, so far as capitalism and imperialism is concerned. we have to be helping empower the working class with clear ideas and clear demands for when that day comes. Dan, I think that's probably us. If it is, I'm deeply grateful to all of you for a wonderful meeting. Thanks very much indeed for coming. And those watching on other platforms other than Zoom, please join us in the Workers' Party of Britain. I promise you, you won't regret it.